interesting historical case of a person who both made essential positive contributions to humanity and committed unforgivable transgressions. Fritz Haber is the most clear example. In the early 20th century there was a panic over food shortages across the world with a ballooning population. There simply wasn't enough farmable land and not enough ammonia to fertilize land. Haber invented a way to synthesize ammonia, exponentially increasing the carrying capacity of the human race. He also was the father of chemical warfare, and helped the Germans develop chemical weapons in World War I. His wife was so ashamed that he had brought that evil into the world that she committed suicide in his backyard. He left his 12-year-old son at home and went to work with his wife's corpse in the backyard. Haber was German and Jewish. In World War II, one of his chemical pesticides, Zyklon A, was modified to create Zyklon B, the gas used during the Holocaust. Haber died in 1934, but Zyklon B was almost certainly used against his family. Alfred Nobel had a similar legacy. He was the first one to synthesize nitroglycerine, which is an incredibly useful heart medication and industrial explosive for things like mining, clearing land for roads and buildings, etc. It's also the basis of most modern wartime explosives. Fun fact: he actually created the Nobel Peace Prize out of shame for how many people his invention killed. He didn't want to be remembered as the guy who created such a horrible weapon, which actually worked, partly because his invention wasn't named after him, and partly because nitrate explosives were overshadowed by nuclear ones a few decades later. Nobel wasn't the first person to synthesize nitroglycerine. That was Ascanio Sobrero. He was the first person to figure out how to stabilize it by absorbing the liquid into a solid matrix and commercialize the resulting dynamite. Fr. Bartholomew de las Casas, Spaniard who wrote of the awful treatment of the indigenous people of the New World, and suggested that they stop enslaving them and replace them with African slaves. He was so close, and yet, so far. Alexander Graham Bell. Everyone knows him for the telephone, but he had awful backwards ideas about deaf people. He wanted to eliminate them from society, didn't want deaf people to talk to each other or marry and reproduce. He was a strong advocate for the banning of sign language. He really bent the idea on what is best for deaf people, and his impacts are still seen in schools today. His foundation is still spreading the lie that sign language is bad. I don't get his hatred of deaf people, as his wife and mother-in-law were deaf, but the telephone was his attempt at fixing them. His wife and mother-in-law were deaf. There's your answer. Genghis Khan committed untold crimes against humanity, but his empire revitalized the Silk Road and allowed intracontinental travel in Eurasia to flourish, which gave Europe a taste of long-distance trade and planted the seeds of the West's global empires that eventually dominated the world. He's also responsible for the existence of a good chunk of the world. 16 million men living right now have a Y chromosome that can be traced back to Genghis Khan. That's 0.5% of the world. And that's not including any of the women who can be traced back to him. 0.02%, but still impressive. Well, not really sure if this can be attributed to him as an addition. I imagine he killed more people than he fathered. I'm surprised I haven't spotted Fred Phelps yet, founder of the vile Westboro Baptist Church. Yet also apparently he was a brilliant civil rights attorney in the 1960s who would take on racial discrimination cases that no other lawyers would touch. Wait, Fred Phelps was a civil rights attorney? WTF? Some people think WBC was just an excuse to bait targets into denying them their free speech rights and then use Phelps' knowledge of the law to sue and win big money. Mindy Street, Claire, coke addict, corporate lawyer. But she developed plans for a global foundation that would help kids all over the world advance human rights, revolutionize agriculture, and improve every nation and every society in every possible way. It's complicated. Do you have any coke? No, but I can make the wind chimes work. Gandhi hated the blacks. He also slept naked with young girls and liked to give them enemas. I didn't think that sentence could get worse, but here we are. Robert McNamara recommended dropping the atomic bomb and got the US into Vietnam. In between WW2 and Vietnam, he was CEO of Ford Motor Company, where he implemented the use of seat belts. Expected casualties for a land invasion were well over 1 million per side. The atom bomb was a net benefit for the Japanese. I think the estimates were way higher than that. It was 1-2 million American soldiers and 5-10 million Japanese, and that's just from direct combat deaths. Walter Wenck was a German officer during World War II who had fought on several fronts and earned the Iron Cross from the German military. However, during the Battle of Berlin he was given an order to push into the city and hold back the millions of Soviet troops attacking the city. Many of his troops were either young boys or older men, all of whom were low on ammunition. He disobeyed orders and launched a breakthrough assault to relieve encircled groups of soldiers and civilians, then turned and broke out the way he'd come, protecting over 250,000 civilians and non-combatants from the Soviet onslaught all the way to the Elbe River, across which were the American lines. Wenck held a line of defense long enough for all the civilians and soldiers rescued to retreat across a broken bridge to the American lines and surrender to them, rather than the Soviets, with himself being one of the very last to cross the bridge, shortly before it was destroyed by Soviet artillery. Man looks like Mr. Rogers in an artsy uniform. Won't you be my neighbor? Not you, Malachi. You could say this about plenty of people. George Washington has slaves, and slaughtered innocent people, along with his own men, for not wanting to fight the British. Winston Churchill allowed massive famines in India to go unchecked and kill millions. Gandhi literally slept with his children. And then there are usually bad people who did great things. Hitler fought for animal welfare and fought smoking all across Germany. Genghis Khan helped the Mongol people live great lives and helped set back climate change by a couple years. There are no all good people, and there are no all bad people. That's not how people or history work. To assert to the contrary is not only false, but absurd. Most of America's founding fathers were very progressive for their time. It's easy to look back at them and judge them now that we're all a couple of centuries and a bit removed from them. It's easy to forget that any progress we've made for equality and civil rights was an incremental thing and some parts of the world are still very backwards by modern Western standards for their time. The funny thing is that this works both ways. If we shouldn't bring their negative aspects into today's world because it was progressive at the time, we need to do the same thing about positive aspects. Whatever intentions they had are not good because it's what the founders wanted when discussing today's issues. At the end of the day, they have been dead for 200 years and their opinions have no weight to today's issues. If we aren't going to apply today's standards to their opinions, then we also shouldn't use their opinions to solve today's problems. J. Marion Sims pioneered the surgical cure for lady partal fistulas which gave thousands of women their lives and dignity back. Did it by performing experimental surgeries on black slaves without anesthesia. His part in history is super effed. Modern gynecology owes a lot to him, but he made discoveries in a terrible way. Forcibly gave slave women fistulas in order to figure out how to fix them, and would repeatedly do it to the same women. Didn't believe black people could feel pain so wouldn't use anesthetics, but then was notorious for fostering opium addiction and former patients. Probably the least bad thing he did was visually do all of his experiments, which was seen as very taboo at the time. Doctors oftentimes would not look at a patient's genitalia, but he said, "No man, I need to see all this to figure it out." He dehumanized those women in quite a few different ways. To be fair, anesthesia wasn't commonly used at the time. It was expensive and using it came with significant risks. Thomas Midgley invented both leaded gasoline and CFCs. He was able to make a lot of expensive technology extremely cheap and efficient, at only the cost of thousands of years of damage to the environment. https Simple Wikipedia org wiki Thomas Midgley. It's easy to talk about CFCs in a negative light nowadays, but most people don't realize that before them, refrigerators used ammonia or methyl chloride, both of which are incredibly toxic. So CFCs weren't great, but they were still a lot better than what they replaced. FWIW. CFCs remain critical to aviation safety. Halon 1411 is the best fire extinguisher compound known to humanity. Basically every aircraft has several Halon 1411 Fire-X units on board. Yep, cheaper and more efficient than the current alternatives, but also effed up the environment for thousands of years. He was exceptionally good at finding the shortcut to difficult problems, but not seeing the ramification of those actions. Nobel created the Nobel Prize. a reward for significant contributions to the good of man, because someone accidentally wrote an incorrect obituary calling him scum for creating explosives that would change war forever. Dart that he invented in an attempt to make mining safer and more efficient. Margaret Sanger helped develop birth control, giving women around the world more control over their bodies and helping progress family planning, and started the organization which would become Planned Parenthood, but was also very racist, anti-Semitic, and largely developed those products to decrease the number of non-white people in the world. She's quoted in a letter to the editor of the American Journal of Public Health in 1981 as saying birth control, to create a race of thoroughbreds and more children from the fit, less from the unfit, that is the chief aim of birth control. It was a great privilege when I was told that I would receive this award. I admire Margaret Sanger enormously, her courage, her tenacity, her vision when I think about what she did all those years ago in Brooklyn, taking on archetypes, taking on attitudes and accusations flowing from all directions. I'm really in awe of her. There are a lot of lessons we can learn from her life, from the causes she launched and fought for and scarified for so greatly. Hillary Clinton, 2014. Clinton also once had a speech praising Nancy Reagan for starting the conversation about HIV/AIDS. It's just another case of history sugarcoating and whitewashing historical figures and present-day politicians trying to exploit it. Antonio Agas Moniz was a neurologist and Nobel laureate whose work consisted of attempts to find effective treatment for severe mental illnesses for which there was no treatment at the time. Early 20th century. Despite his good intentions, he ended up developing a procedure we know today as a lobotomy. It is completely anachronistic to suggest that frontal lobotomy was an unforgivable transgression. We have to remember the context in which it was invented, and its intended purpose. It came at a time in which we had no medications for severe mental illness, a time in which the only treatment was imprisonment and physical restraint. In that context, he came up with a surgery that gave people who were violently mentally ill a life without violence or pain, where they could live a much more normal life without enduring the pain of 24/7 restraint. Was the treatment misused, overused, and abused? Yes. Does that make its invention for its intended purpose a transgression? No. He could not have anticipated the invention of antipsychotic medications. Working with the tools available at the time, he improved the lives of patients to the best of his ability. Making people into basically walking vegetables doesn't really improve their life though. It may improve their family's life but not the patient's. Dr. Samuel Mudd, a Civil War era doctor who aided John Wilkes Booth in his escape through the South. Before Booth assassinated Abraham Lincoln, he conspired with him during his initial plan to kidnap the president. After the assassination, he treated Booth's injuries from the attempt, housed him for a day, then warned them that the authorities were onto them so they could escape. After being arrested and sentenced to life in prison, he helped curb a yellow fever epidemic in the prison that he was incarcerated in. Adolf Hitler. He was responsible for WW2 and the Holocaust, but he also killed Hitler. Yeah, but he also murdered the guy who killed Hitler. You jest. But the Vita rockets developed by his orders became the basis for both America's Russia's space programs. Jean Fossey, IMO. She was a world-renowned environmentalist and researcher who spent years in the jungles of Rwanda studying gorillas. She's the author of Gorillas in the Mist, which most people have at least heard of, according to people who knew her. She was also a racist alcoholic who sometimes kidnapped and tortured people she suspected of poaching, including children. One story goes that she beat a suspected poacher's genitals with stinging nettles. TFW no environmentalist CK and ball torture GF. Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. Also there is strong evidence he fathered 6 children with his slave mistress, Sally Hemings. Hemings' children lived in Jefferson's house as slaves and were trained as artisans. Jefferson freed all of Hemings' surviving children, Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston, as they came of age. They were the only slave family freed by Jefferson. Pretty sure Hemings was only like 14 when he brought her to France as his personal assistant too. Mother Teresa. She was known for her work helping the poor and sickly, but she was also known to have dubious ties to shady people who bankrolled her efforts. She was also known to forcibly convert patients on their deathbeds under the guise of spiritual blessings. You forgot the worst part. She denied medical attention for those under her care, saying it's God's will, but she used funds to have surgery which prolonged her life. Not to mention that, even knowing that overpopulation was a huge problem among the poor, she still held with the birth control is evil party line. William Temple Hornaday was one of the first people in America to push for preserving wildlife by keeping it alive, instead of killing it to stuff and put in a museum. He may have been instrumental in saving the American bison from extinction. He also put a black man in his zoo. Hornady like the ammo company? A little late to the party, but here goes anyway. Thomas Midgley is what comes to my mind. In the 30s, refrigerators used dangerous chemicals such as propane and ammonia, which caused several accidents when leaked. Thomas Midgley developed a replacement called Freon, which saved lives and advanced science further. 50 years after his death, the scientific community discovers that Freon had been tearing holes in our ozone layer, causing irreparable harm. He also had a major role in the adoption of leaded gasoline. Dude was a living monkey paw.